Okay, here we go. This is session 36. We are in chapter 5 still. All right, we're at section 5, okay, page 83 in the text. All right, and this title is The Ego's Use of Guilt. Very, very interesting. All right. Just kind of a precursor, pre-comment. We want to say that guilt keeps us fearful of retaliation. All right. You can check it out in your everyday lives. All right. There's always fear of retaliation when we're feeling guilty of something. All right. Which means we must have done something. So in the ego thought system, if it keeps you guilty, it keeps you believing that you did something wrong. Namely, you attacked God, you separated from God, you attacked the oneness, right? And now you're going to pay, right? Don't do the crime if you can't do the time. Okay, let's go. So, excuse me, section 5, the ego's use of guilt. Perhaps some of our concepts will become clearer and more personally meaningful if the ego's use of guilt is clarified. The ego has a purpose, just as the Holy Spirit does. The ego's purpose is fear, because only the fearful can be egotistic. The ego's logic is as impeccable as that of the Holy Spirit, because your mind has the means at its disposal to side with heaven or earth as it elects. But again, remember that both are in you. And we'll go on to paragraph 2. In heaven there is no guilt, because the kingdom is attained through the atonement, which releases you to create. The word create is appropriate here because once you have made it, because what you have made is undone by the Holy Spirit. The blessed residue is restored and therefore continues in creation. What is truly blessed is incapable of giving rise to guilt and must give rise to joy. This makes it invulnerable to the ego because its peace is unassailable. It is always invulnerable to disruption because it is whole. Guilt is always disruptive. Anything that engenders fear is divisive because it obeys the laws of division. If the ego is the symbol of separation, it is also the symbol of guilt. Guilt is more than merely not of God. It is the symbol of attack on God. This is a totally meaningless concept, except to the ego. But do not underestimate the power of the ego's belief in it. This is the belief from which all guilt really stems. This is the seed, right, that germinates and leads to what we experience here in form. Right? It's the idea of guilt. Oh, I did something wrong. Right? The original thought that I did something wrong was that I separated from the oneness. I destroyed the oneness. Right? I therefore attacked the oneness in my quest for individuality. Right? So, it's the belief from which all guilt really stems. All right? And You'll hear the phrase throughout the course and throughout our reading and talking about the course, one problem, one solution. All right? And it becomes simple, theoretically, because the one problem is the belief that I did something wrong. I believe I separated from God. I believe I separated from my source, right? From the oneness. And that belief leads to guilt, right? And in order to avoid the guilt, I project. First thing we did was project out of the one mind. The course is equivalent of the Big Bang Theory. All right? We projected out of the mind, and this whole entire cosmos in all its forms, all right? As Carl Sagan would say, billions and billions of planets, all right? Each, so many of them are capable of so many things that we're not even aware of. It all came to being with that projection. I got to get out of this predicament I'm in. And it all was taking place in the mind, right? The one mind. And you can look at the story of Adam and Eve. Once again, they did something wrong, right? And so then all of a sudden, there's the angry God stomping through the garden, right? Get off my lawn. I told you not to eat that. I'm going to get you. Right? And they were banished. All right? The first thing they did was they hid among the trees. They hid. Right? So, we did something wrong. We got to hide. Oh, I did something wrong. I got to project out of the mind into form. All right? Into a body, into a world, into a huge cosmos. So, guilt is more than merely not of God. It's a symbol of the attack on God. All right? So he says the ego's purpose is fear. All right? Because only the fearful can be egotistical. So the ego has to keep us in a state of fear. Right? Later on, Jesus will describe us as being, uncertain, lonely, and in constant fear. Right? And basically, there's always that, even if we're not aware of it, there's always a low-grade fear going on, And it takes the form of many different things, phobias, and, those are overt, I remember my wonderful wife, Jean, once described it as like we're all ducks on the lake, just floating along. But underneath the water, those feet are going 100 miles an hour. And that's our thoughts, our anxious thoughts. We look like we're gliding along here through our lives, when underneath, those feet are paddling. Trying not to drown, trying to keep afloat. All right? And the ego likes it that way. The ego thought system likes it that way because it exists. Because we think we did something wrong. That's the bottom line. That's the original. That's the origin of fear. I did something wrong. All right? So the ego's logic is as impeccable as that of the Holy Spirit, right? Because your mind has the means at its disposal to side with heaven or earth, right? And your mind is just so powerful, so sharp, right? That the ego, which is part of the mind, is impeccable. It's got impeccable logic, although it's wrong. Its basic premise is wrong. Its foundation is wrong, but it proceeds from there. All right? And it tries to convince us that you did something wrong. That means you're separated from God. Okay? And that's the ego's use of guilt, really. So then Jesus says, in heaven there is no guilt, right? Because the kingdom is attained through atonement. And the idea, and there is no atonement principle in heaven, right? Because you don't need it. But we attain the memory of our true selves through the atonement principle, right? A phrase from the Course in Miracles, right? And the atonement principle is the awareness that you never separated from God. You are innocent, not guilty. Step down. Next case. Right? You're not guilty. Right? But we have to, in the condition we're in, we have to work on that. Right? We have to realize when we do feel guilty and frightened and less than, because all those things come from the idea of I did something wrong. You feel an automatic sense of lack, there's something wrong with me, all that stuff. Okay? But he says the atonement, it releases you to create. All right? And he says the word create is appropriate here. Because the atonement, the idea that you never did anything wrong, it brings you back to your true existence and your true occupation, so to speak, which is creating like the Creator. And that doesn't mean, creating birds and trees and flowers. It's the extension of everything, the extension of the oneness, the extension of that great expanse of all-inclusive invulnerability, happiness, bliss, all those things. All right? And that's what we extend in our natural state. Excuse me. Let's look at this throat thing going on. That's what we do in our natural state, and that's what the atonement releases us to do. It releases us from the silly idea that you can separate from God, from the silly idea that you can leave the mind that thought of you. All right? All right? So the word create is appropriate here because once what you have made is undone by the Holy Spirit, the blessed residue is restored and therefore continues in creation. A much more poetic way to describe. All right. So the Holy Spirit undoes all our mishigash here, all our nonsense, all the craziness. And the blessed residue is restored and therefore continues in creation. All right. What is truly blessed is incapable of giving rise to guilt. In your true state, guilt is inconceivable. Right? And in your true state, it must give rise to joy. There is only joy. Right? And this makes it invulnerable to the ego because its peace is unassailable. This is the peace that passes all understanding. Right? It's unassailable. Right? It is invulnerable to disruption because it is whole. Right? Guilt is always disruptive. Right? Anything that engenders fear is divisive because it obeys the laws of division. Right? What's the first division? Oh, I divided myself from the oneness. And it begins. All right? The detour into fear begins, as Jesus would say. right? So if the ego is the symbol of the separation, it is also the symbol of guilt. Guilt is merely, it's more than merely not of God. It's the symbol of the attack on God. This is totally meaningless. It's a totally meaningless concept, except to the ego. But do not underestimate the power of the ego's belief in it. This is the belief from which all guilt really stems, right? The belief that I have attacked God in my desire to be individual, my thought of separation. So in my belief in that being, I attacked God. And he says, don't underestimate the ego's belief in that, right? It's firm belief, because it's the belief from which all guilt stems. All guilt. One problem, one solution. The problems look myriad. There's unbelievable, right? Even Jay-Z got 99, right? But they all come from the same place. The idea that I separated from God. He said, but it didn't happen, but we place our faith in the ego, and the ego holds on to that. You did something. I'll prove it to you. Watch. Right? So, page 84, paragraph 3. The ego is the part of the mind that believes in division. How could part of God detach itself without believing it is attacking him? We spoke before of the authority problem as based on the concept of usurping God's power. The ego believes that this is what you did because it believes that it is you. Right? If you identify with the ego, you must perceive yourself as guilty, and you will fear punishment. The ego is quite literally a fearful thought. However ridiculous the idea of attacking God may be to the sane mind, never forget that the ego is not sane. It represents a delusional system, and it speaks for it. Listening to the ego's voice means that you believe it is possible to attack God, and that a part of him has been torn away by you. Fear of retaliation from without follows, because the severity of the guilt is so acute that it must be projected. Okay, so he said the severity of this guilt, once you believe that you attacked God, you separated from the oneness, you divided from the oneness. He says the severity of that guilt is so enormous that our belief system, our insane belief system, which we have adopted now, tells us in order to get rid of that guilt, you have to throw it out there, project it onto somebody else or something else. And so we project it onto God, the first thing, the only thing we know at that point. We project that enormous guilt onto God. He's going to get us now. All right? So the fear of retaliation arises in the mind. Fear of retaliation from without, from outside of me. So the retaliation is coming from outside. That follows because the severity of the guilt is so acute that it must be projected. Right? And that's why Dr. Wapnick, who was a clinical psychologist, right, from Adelphi University, right, he said thank you to Freud for his theories on projection. We see that what we can't stand, that severity of that guilt. We repress it. We push it down. But what is repressed has to get pushed out. Okay? And if you get hip to that, as we used to say, you see it in everyday behavior. Everyday behavior. It's not me, it's you. In so many different ways. So many different ways. You know. And that's what we need to keep an eye out for. That desire to project guilt onto an other. Right? And so we become vigilant for that. And this is how the ego thought system gets undone. Because we have a sincere desire to return to peace. I don't know how to get there. I need a guide. All right? I'm in this nutty jungle, the ego jungle. All right? And left to my own devices, I'll be staying here for a while. I'll be caught in that cave looking at the shadows on the wall. All right? But I need a guide. So I call on Jesus, the embodiment of the Holy Spirit. I call on the memory of who I am, my higher mind, to help me reinterpret what I'm thinking here. I'm thinking this person has done something to me. All right. I'm willing to see it otherwise. I'm willing to let the innocence arise. I'm willing to let their innocence arise in my awareness. That's the process of forgiveness in the Course. And giving and receiving are simultaneous. Right? I want that. I am willing to see the innocence, and therefore my own innocence arises in my mind, which wipes out the guilt. I no longer feel guilty, so there's no longer a need to project the guilt. Right? And because we are the way we are, we at first become very afraid of this individual being annihilated. And so the thought of complete innocence, the thought of that abstract existence is threatening. And so I go back to the detour into fear. And so it seems like we're working our way, you know. Start where you are, and that's where I am, all right? So every time that guilt in whatever form, you know, it could come up in a form of self-hatred, come up in a form of hatred of another, right? Anger, right, at another, anger at yourself, right? These are the flags that we look for. These are the signs we look for. And if we're willing, we bring them to the higher mind, to Holy Spirit, to Jesus. Help me to see this correctly. I want corrected vision. I want corrected perception. Right? And after correcting perception enough, there's a quality, there's a shift, a qualitative shift happens. And we begin to see our situations here quite differently. All right? We start seeing them through the eyes of innocence. Right? And that's what we're working toward until the abstract existence is no longer fearful. Right? And that's where we're going. All right? But guilt keeps us here. The belief in guilt keeps us here, firmly rooted in this divisive world. All right? So, ego is part of the mind that believes in division. It constantly separates, constantly is dividing. All right? Let's go to paragraph 4. Whatever you accept into your mind has reality for you. It is your acceptance of it that makes it real. If you enthrone the ego in your mind, you're allowing it to enter, makes it your reality. This is because the mind is capable of creating reality or making illusions. I said before that you must learn to think with God. To think with Him is to think like Him. This engenders joy, not guilt, because it is natural. Guilt is a sure sign that your thinking is unnatural. Unnatural thinking will always be attended with guilt, because it is the belief in sin. The ego does not perceive sin as a lack of love, but as a positive act of assault. This is necessary to the ego's survival because as soon as you regard sin as a lack, you will automatically attempt to remedy the situation, and you will succeed. The ego regards this as doom, but you must learn to regard it as freedom. All right. By going to the right mind, all right, and looking at the ego system, the wrong mind, right, looking at it without judgment, right, that's how we remedy the situation, right? So the ego doesn't perceive the thought of sin as a lack of love, right? But as a positive act of assault. It means you did it, right? You feel guilty, you did something wrong. That means you assaulted the oneness. You did it, all right? So this is, but you will attempt to remedy the situation, all right? By going to Holy Spirit. And the ego regards this as doom. Don't do that. Because the ego knows the minute our true existence, the memory of that arises in our mind, the ego is gone, right? So the ego regards this as doom, right? But going to the right mind, he says, you must regard it as freedom. Freedom from this nutty thought system that we have adopted, that we have aligned ourselves with. Paragraph 5, bottom of 84. The guiltless mind cannot suffer. Being sane, the mind heals the body because it has been healed. The sane mind cannot conceive of illness because it cannot conceive of attacking anyone or anything. I said before that illness is a form of magic. It might be better to say that it is a form of magical solution. The ego believes that by punishing itself, it will mitigate the punishment of God. Yet even in this, it is arrogant. It attributes to God a punishing intent, and then takes this intent as its own prerogative. It tries to usurp all the functions of God as it perceives them, because it recognizes that only total allegiance can be trusted. Right? So the ego tries to take all of God's functions as it sees it, because it wants total allegiance. All right? So Jesus makes the reference to the word magic, all right, which means a solution that is outside of the mind. Right? Anything outside of the mind, going back to the oneness, is magic. Right? Jesus doesn't condemn it, doesn't tell you to judge, oh, I'm using magic, I took an aspirin. Don't get like that. Go through your normal life, all right? Because Jesus says later on that, until you're used to that quality of shift, that qualitative shift, he says you might be too afraid of the awareness of who you are, all right? And that can be overwhelming, all right? As they used to say in the 60s, it'll blow your mind, all right? So a little magic, a little miracle, all right? Start where you are, okay? All right? So the sane mind cannot conceive of illness, right? Because it cannot conceive of attacking anyone or anything. So he's telling us that the ego, which is not the sane mind, it relishes attack even on the body, right? With diseases and pain and all this, okay? And it sees it as a form of a solution. Well, it's a punishment for being you, okay? Like Bob Dylan would say, look out, kid, it's something you did. God knows when, but you're doing it again. And that's what the ego tells us. Look out, it's something you did. God knows when, but you're doing it again. And therefore, you have to pay. It's painful. You're sick. You did something wrong. How many times you hear, friends of yours, or even people you don't even know, they're sick, and they what did I do? What did I do to deserve this? All right? Not the time to go all metaphysical on them, right? Just be kind. And be kind to yourself, too. Don't do that to yourself. What did I do wrong? Right? The answer is you never did anything wrong. Right? You made a mistake by believing that you were separated from God. So let's get back to the truth, all right? As soon as you can. All right? So the ego believes that by punishing itself, it will mitigate the punishment of God. Right? So it projects onto God. God is now a punishing God. And the ego believes by punishing itself, it will mitigate the punishment, all right? That's why they all this crazy sacrificing and, enduring things, It's supposed to mitigate your punishment in the hereafter, right? But Jesus says, but even that thought is arrogant, all right? First of all, it attributes to God a punishing intent. First of all, it makes God a punisher, and then it tries to take that job away from God, and says, "No, I could do that too. I'll do it myself. I'll take care of it." All right? Just to make us have allegiance to the ego, right? We could do everything God does. Don't worry. We can even punish ourselves. He says, "Look, come on, look at it. Isn't that crazy?" Right? And it is. All right? Just as another side note, that word sane, he says the sane mind cannot conceive of illness. Okay? Sane, the word sane comes from the Latin root sano, right, which means sound, healthy. All right? So the healthy mind, the healed mind, can't conceive of illness. All right? Just throw in a little Latin for you, So, but it's one of the things that I like the poetic nature of the Course, that words are chosen specifically, right? That pinpoint meaning, putting us in that direction, So paragraph 6 on page 85. The ego cannot oppose the laws of God any more than you can, but it can interpret them according to what it wants, just as you can. That is why the question, what do you want, must be answered. You are answering it every minute and every second, and each moment of decision is a judgment that is anything but ineffectual. Right? Every moment is a decision, it's a judgment that is anything but ineffectual. It has effects. Its effects will follow automatically until the decision is changed. Remember, though, that the alternatives themselves are unalterable. The Holy Spirit, like the ego, is a decision. Therefore, they constitute all the alternatives the mind can accept and obey. The Holy Spirit and the ego are the only choices open to you. God created one, and so you cannot eradicate it. Right? You made the other, and so you can. Right? Only what God creates is irreversible and unchangeable. What you made can always be changed, because when you do not think like God, you are not really thinking at all. Delusional ideas are not real thoughts, although you can believe in them, but you are wrong. The function of thought comes from God and is in God. As a part of His thought, you cannot think apart from Him. Take that in, okay? The function of thought comes from God. The function of thought comes from your original source, right? From the source of all creation, right? It comes from God, right? As part of His thought, all right, we are part of His thought. His thought extended, and we are that, right? As part of His thought. You cannot think apart from Him. As part of His thought, you cannot think apart from Him. Right? Just driving that point home, which He will over and over again. Right? As part of the thought of God, you can't separate from that. You can't be apart from that. Anything else is delusional thinking, and you can believe in delusional thinking, right? Delusions are quite believable, right? I mean, hallucinations are quite believable, right? But they can be undone. These things can be undone. And he says, these effects, you choose the Holy Spirit or the ego every moment of the day, right? And the effects, right, follow automatically, right? And the effects are unalterable, right, until the decision is changed, right? And so I have to notice first, wow, something's wrong here, right? I keep doing the same things with the same results, right? There must be a better way, right? I'm tired of chaos and confusion. I'm tired of conflict. I'm tired of anger and hatred and fear. I'm tired of it. There has to be a better way. That's the invitation, right, to change my decision for the ego, right? I go back to my mind. As Ken would say, there's the decision maker. in the mind. And we go back to the decision maker and choose once again. Holy Spirit, help me to see correctly. Help me to have my perception changed. And we work our way back. All right? As Jesus said, he came to help us. And you work from the bottom up. Start from where you are. He says the Holy Spirit and the ego are the only choices open to you. All right? God created the Holy Spirit. We miscreated the ego. All right? All right? And the ego can be undone. All right? This is a course in undoing. Right? And we undone things in specific until we can generalize. Right? And the generalization becomes, I just don't want to be separated anymore. Right? I don't want the fear, I don't want the guilt. Okay? So, and he says, just to remind us, he says, you cannot think apart from God. Right? You can believe it, but it's not possible. And in one moment, we will all realize that. Okay? Paragraph 7. Irrational thought is disordered thought. God himself orders your thought because your thought was created by him. Guilt feelings are always a sign that you do not know this. They also show that you believe you can think apart from God, and you want to. Every disordered thought is attended by guilt at its inception and maintained by guilt in its continuance. Guilt is inescapable by those who believe they order their own thoughts and must therefore obey their dictates. This makes them feel responsible for their errors without recognizing that by accepting this responsibility, they are reacting irresponsibly. If the sole responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept the atonement for himself, and I assure you that it is, then the responsibility for what is atoned for cannot be yours. The dilemma cannot be resolved except by accepting the solution of undoing. You would be responsible for the effects of all your wrong thinking if it could not be undone. The purpose of the atonement is to save the past in purified form only. If you accept the remedy for disordered thought, a remedy whose efficacy is beyond doubt, how can its symptoms remain? Okay. So the remedy for disordered thought is the atonement, the fact that you never separated from God, right? Rising back up into your spiritual mind. That's the remedy for disordered thought. It's going back to the right mind. Right? A remedy whose efficacy is beyond doubt. You know, like they used to say, try it, you'll like it. Right? We go back to the right mind and don't judge. Right? We ask for help with our projections. Right? So he says, if you accept the remedy, right, how can the symptoms remain? Right? If we accept the atonement, how can the ego thought system remain? Right? The atonement is the remembrance of who you are. The fact that you did not separate from God. You did not leave the mind that thinks of you. Right? And that's the remedy. And once the remedy is accepted, right, how can the symptoms remain? Right? The remedy does away with the symptoms, the ego thought system. Paragraph 8, page 86. The continuing decision to remain separated is the only possible reason for continuing guilt feelings. We have said this before, but did not emphasize the destructive results of the decision. Any decision of the mind will affect both behavior and experience. What you want, you expect. This is not delusional. What your mind does make, your mind does make your future, and it will turn it back to full creation at any minute if it accepts the atonement first. It will also return to full creation the instant it has done so. Having given up disordered thought, the proper ordering of thought becomes quite apparent. All right. So, he says the continuing decision to remain separated is the only possible reason for continuing guilt feelings. Right? And he says that's what you want. Right? Until you no longer want that. Right? Like Eckhart Tolle says to some people at his retreats, some people will leave on the first day, and he says that's okay. He says they'll be back when they have enough pain. And that's basically what Jesus is going to tell us. Right? Right? Now Eckhart Tolle is talking about experiencing the expansiveness of the mind, of who you are, right? In the present, right? Where there is no past, which is sin, guilt, and fear. And there is no future. Well, fear is in the future, right? So there's no guilt and there's no fear. It's only all right now, right? He's a voice that's using different language, right? But he would say they'll be back when they have enough pain, right? They'll be looking for the true solution, all right? And he said that any decision of the mind will affect both behavior and experience. So if I decide that I believe I'm separated from God, that will be reflected in my behavior and my experience. Right? And if I choose the right mind, the higher mind, if I choose to be guided by Jesus and Holy Spirit, my experiences will reflect that, right? And my behavior will reflect that. Right? I will be guided by truth. And he says, what you want, you expect. He says, this is not delusional. Your mind does make your future, and it will turn it back to full creation at any minute if it accepts the atonement first. So if I accept my own innocence, if I accept the fact that I never separated from God, my mind will return to full creation, which is extension of the thought of God. Right? Having given up its disordered thought, the proper ordering of thought becomes quite apparent. So having given up disordered thought, which is the ego, right, the proper ordering of thought becomes apparent. Right? To put it into other words, Jesus will say, we'll know the difference between the meaningful and the meaningless. Right? Okay? And the ego uses guilt to keep us in the belief that we separated from God. Okay? Guilt is a sure sign that your thinking is unnatural. Okay. Somebody going up and down the street with a backfiring engine. Oh, that's what we hope it is anyway. Okay then, to pull us out of the space, all right? And he says the choice, we have that choice at any moment, right? I mean, it could just be a simple plea. Help me to see correctly. What is it that I want? What do you want? I want the peace. I want the peace of God. The peace of God is that fertile ground in which the proper ordering of thought takes place, all right? In which we see perception truly. Okay? So we'll leave it at that. And we'll see you for the next session, which time and eternity will be the next thing. All right then. Have a great day. Have a great week. All right? And we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.